start.spring.io.
All right. Yes, we have the start.spring.io starting gun has been fired. That means we are ready for day 2 of Spring One Tour. I am Bob Brindley here again with Mark Heckler. We've added some friends. Hopefully you were able to digest all of the wonderful information that I say digest because it was omakase. So anyway, digest a lot of the information from yesterday to have an hour more of discussing some of those points, bringing up new points. We have our Q&A set up. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. Our friend Yvonne will be on the ones and twos managing those questions and trying to add them to the team so that they can answer them. Again, this is Spring One Tour, day 2. And I'm excited to bring in our panelists. We have 3 excellent additions besides the wonderful Mark Heckler to kind of bring in their thoughts on all things Spring Boot. First, we're going to have Greg Turnquist. Greg, he works on the Spring team as a principal developer at VMware. And then we have Violeta Georgieva, who also works at VMware and is a Reactor Netty lead committer. And then, of course, the doctor is in, Dr. Dave Syer. He's a founder of Spring Cloud, Spring Boot, Spring Batch, and the lead of Spring Security OAuth. So he knows a thing or two about Spring. And so, yes, let's welcome them and Mark Heckler back. Mark, he's just a guy. He gets no other introduction. Just Mark. He's a guy. No. Welcome, Mark. It's great to see you. How are you, sir?
I'm well, and as you mentioned, believe it or not, I do have friends, or at least I will once I Venmo them.
They're on the payroll. Yeah, they're on the payroll.
Okay, fine. Everybody, please join. Check your accounts. Please join.
Yay! All right. You should have received it if you have not by now.
Yes.
So yes. Anyway, welcome panel. We're, as said, we're going to have a fireside chat. Greg has definitely taken that to heart. Thank you, sir. And so we are, and Violeta is on brand. It's so great. She has the backdrop working. I can't, so I just had to put like where I'm at right now. So thank you, Violeta, for representing the beautiful artwork that was created for this specific show. And so well done. Kudos, hats off to you. So yeah, so I think just a couple things at the top. A reminder, Q&A. If you have any questions, please put those in there. We have some questions from yesterday, and then obviously we have some other thoughts that Mark and the team have put together. It's going to be a great hour, and I'm going to stop talking so that you all can use up all the time. All right, thank you so much, and enjoy.
Oh, wow. Okay. He kind of cut off there at the end, and I thought maybe we lost all volume, all sound. Okay, so everyone can hear me, right?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Good. All right. Yes. Thumbs up. All right. Excellent. All right. So yeah, we had, I feel kind of bad because the one question I said, hey, hold on to that and I'll answer it before I leave today, if not tomorrow. Well, I completely forgot and closed out, and, I didn't accidentally hit the leave button. I just forgot to respond to the question. So the one question was, what about JWT JOTS instead of plain login and password? Yes, fully supported JOTS in terms of Spring Security OAuth, as well as opaque tokens. So yeah, that's that. I just didn't have a chance to show all of that yesterday, but yep, it's all in there. So yeah, sorry I didn't get that answered yesterday. Let's go ahead and start off with the kind of list of questions we do have submitted. And if people think of more and want to toss those into the chat, the Q&A, however we are doing that, looks like the Q&A maybe. Yeah, maybe even the Q&A. Then by all means do that, and we will slipstream those in with the list we have here going. But yeah, let's kind of start things off with a really simple, easy, very well-defined question. Probably only take a few seconds to answer, but blocking versus reactive. So what are some thoughts on when to choose one versus the other? And I'm kind of looking at Violeta, but obviously everybody probably has something to say on this in this regard. So first, hello, Violeta.
Hi. Nice to be here today.
Great to see you again. It's been a while. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately virtual, but maybe next year we will be live.
Right. Yeah. And this is, worse in some ways, better in others, but I guess the upside is we're all safe. We're all continuing to get things done and try to, continue as intended, planned, whatever. So,
Yeah, absolutely agree.
so what do you think? Blocking versus reactive, the old imperative versus reactive question. You have any thoughts on that whatsoever you want to share?
Yeah, I tend to say that actually reactive is not a silver bullet,
What? What? Sorry,
There
I'll
is
be quiet
no
now.
thing like a silver bullet for everything. But definitely there are use cases, scenarios where reactive and non-blocking are better than blocking. And my favorite scenario is remote calls. Because with remote calls, you have so many things that you cannot control, starting from the network and how the remote system behaves. And yeah, you can imagine how the things will happen if you use blocking, where by default we have threads per request, and we block all our threads waiting for the remote system to respond, right? So here with reactive and non-blocking, you definitely will gain the best from that world. Maybe another scenario will be with clients, because nowadays with mobiles, you have so much variety of different clients with different network latencies. So some of them are fast, some of them are slow. And again, you do not want to block while waiting for your client to consume the response, right?
My real skepticism in reactive programming was whether the Java community would go for that, because I remember seeing this sort of stuff discussed 4 or 5 years ago, and I'm like, people going to go for that? But then Java 8 came out with the Stream API, which was bold at the time, and everybody ate that up like crazy. And so when people ask me, I sit there and say, if you can do Java streams, then you can walk over here and do reactive.
Yeah, yes, true. And I even separate the things like before servlet specification 3.1 and after that, because with servlet 3.1 we have non-blocking API in the servlet, so you can even use non-blocking in your favorite with your favorite servlet container. And actually, with our reactive stack, we give such opportunity to people to choose what runtime to use. You can use your favorite servlet container with the reactive stack in Spring.
Yeah, that's one thing I don't think maybe we bring out enough. I try to every chance I get, or when I don't forget to mention it. But I think so many times in the field, the general field of software development, that when something new comes on the scene, there are two reactions, right? One is, get that away from me. I'm perfectly happy with what I'm doing with the tools I'm using. And the other is, I have to convert everything to this. And, like, this is a new hammer and everything is now a nail. And kind of corresponding to that second thing is that many times that new paradigm comes in, and there's a reason we call them new paradigms, because many times you have to reorient your thinking quite dramatically. However, I think sometimes we don't necessarily make it easy to make that transition. And within Spring in general and the Spring community, we do try to, I think, make transitions much easier for developers to do, because even if I am sitting out in corporation XYZ and we've got a real valid use case that, man, this looks like the perfect fit for a reactive solution. Fact of the matter is, even if that's 100% end-to-end reactive, then that may take up 20% of my time, because I may still be working on the other 80% of my time, working on applications and systems that are non-reactive, that are blocking throughout. So I think within Spring, we make this very easy to and as frictionless as possible to switch gears, to not have that that barrier to switching between the different paradigms, and not to have to check all your existing knowledge at the door, throw that away. It's no longer any good. We have to start fresh. And I feel like we do a really great job with that. So that's something I think, drops those barriers to entry quite dramatically.
Yeah, that's very true.
Well, and that's no accident. Go ahead, Dave.
Do we have any numbers? Do we know how many Spring users have adopted any of the reactive technologies? I guess we could look at download numbers or something. My impression is it's still actually a minority. I mean, it's always an interesting topic of discussion for fireside chats and things like that, and conference talks. But is it really mainstream yet? I don't think so. Is it ever going to be mainstream? I'm not even sure about that. Like, I'm the guy. Yeah. I mean, I'm the only person on this call who hasn't written a book about Reactive or isn't on the committers list for a Reactive project. So I can be the devil's advocate. I mean, I like the tools, and they certainly have their place, but I don't know. I mean, nobody's going to bet the farm on it, right? And what about Project Loom? Doesn't that make everything magically? That's a silver bullet, right? Isn't it, Violeta?
Let's see.
Bated breath.
No, I doubt very much if it is. No, I mean, everybody's going to have to rewrite everything for Loom, right, as well. So
yeah, if you're ready to wait till Java 17.
Yeah, there's that as well. Yeah. Well, another thing, if I'm being devil's advocate, right? So, I mean, you can do a lot of non-blocking stuff now in all of the full stack, basically, all the way down to the database, right? But it's still relatively immature, right, compared to the other blocking side, which has been around for longer. So, would I want to start using R2DBC on a new project? I don't know. I certainly wouldn't. You wouldn't get any ORM, right? So there's no Hibernate in non-blocking. So
well, and to talk a little bit about R2DBC, I mean, if you're not familiar with it, that's the Reactive Relational Database Connectivity spec that at the time Pivotal started working on, which is now VMware, of course, about 3 years ago. And there was a bit of a community that was wanting to use Reactive, Reactor, Spring Web Flux, but they needed to talk to a relational database. It's like the numbers are like 80% of projects want to talk to a relational database, despite 101 NoSQL stores out there. People want to talk to that. And so we worked on a specification, an SPI, to make that possible so you could take it to that level. And the response has been that we now have, it's almost like we don't have enough people to respond to the pull requests coming into drivers. We have there's drivers out there for MySQL, Postgres, Oracle, H2, and we're getting a lot of input from people wanting to, hey, can you support this? Can you support that? It may not be 1.0 GA yet, but there's a lot of action on there.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very interesting and active community.
So it's still a minority, I agree with that. I think there are maybe some of the biggest, hardest problems are minority situations that you have to tackle.
There's a question in the Q&A about Loom, if anybody wants to respond to it. I don't know enough about it in detail, but I don't think, I mean, there are definitely features of Reactor, right, that are unique.
Yeah, we still want back pressure, for example.
Back pressure, for instance, yeah. So
for
there
example,
are things that you don't get.
Yeah, for example, we still want, there are use cases with our socket to propagate that back pressure through the network. So I don't think with Loom we'll solve that, right?
No, but if you're just doing HTTP, then I don't know, there's quite a good chance that just your bog standard servlet container with Loom will work pretty well, right? So it might be worth holding out if you just want the the reduced resource. It's all about resource usage, right? If you want to save a bit of money, it might be worth waiting till Java 17 is what you're saying.
Yeah, when we speak about non-blocking, yeah, Loom fits, but when we speak for reactive, it's not
the same
only
thing.
non-blocking. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I remember seeing metrics on, like, basically if you're about to max out your existing set of servers and you need to call up and order another batch of AWS nodes to be spun up and your cloud bill's about to go through the roof, maybe you need to start investigating reactive and squeezing more out of your current situation. And the other space I think about was like mobile-based apps where the amount of power you're consuming drains phones. And so, we don't run Java on phones, but that's one of the other places where your budget can come in to be a critical factor.
Yeah, if you're actually running on a battery, that makes it puts a different perspective on things, doesn't it? Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like having an AWS bill, which they can be pretty eye-watering.
Well, do we want to yeah, so let's see. Let's kind of, gosh, some of these questions we've actually kind of slid into, so we may just say, yeah, check, but I don't want to skip over them in case somebody has something more to add. Pros and cons of going all in on Webflux. And Webflux, I guess let's take this and broaden this all the way down to, let's say, RTDBC or reactive database, not just RTDBC, but obviously reactive database interactions with whatever story you choose, and RSocket. So let's broaden that out even more. So what the pros and cons of going all in? Dave mentioned earlier the relative, and I do want to say relative, immaturity of the tooling, because I mean, let's face it, Reactive has been a much more recent entrant to the Java realm than just imperative Java, because obviously from day one we had imperative Java. So
yeah, and I don't want to be a wet blanket, but it's not just the tools that are immature, it's the skills in the marketplace, right? I mean, it's quite hard to hire somebody who knows about RSocket and would know what to do with it.
Yeah.
So we've got some, groundwork to do to build up to the point where it's kind of common knowledge and common skill set. I think Spring helps. I think, like Greg said, was it Mark? Both of you said, having a Spring programming model actually eases the transitions. It always makes it easier to go from where you are to where you want to be if you have Spring on the class path, if you're using it properly, at least anyway. So, that's the good story. And I think we have been really successful with that, right? I mean, like the Spring Reactive stack is very smoothly blended with the rest of Spring. So you can either use it or not. And, you weigh up the pros and cons like we're doing here, and then you make your choice, and it's not going to be an irrevocable decision. You can always go back, right?
Well, I think I remember chatting
go.
I remember chatting with Rawson a few years ago in Atlanta when they were first working on, this is before Webflux got out, and they really spent a lot of time and care and thought about what's a good Spring way approach of doing that. And so, they came out with, let's use the same annotations, the same approach to that. Let's ease the process. So it's not like you have to throw it all out the window and go into a completely different paradigm. I think that was a very Spring-oriented way of approaching that. Let's reduce Java complexity, as Rod Johnson once said.
Yeah, that was exactly that I wanted to say, that even with your Spring MVC application, you can try reactive types. You can try the new web client instead of the blocking REST template. So even with MVC, you can try something from reactive world, right? And with the latest version of Spring, you even can try the functional programming, not only the experience with the annotations, which is
I
think
that's
great.
a really good fit for like tiny little services, right, where you've only got a few endpoints to play with. It's not such a great fit for large UI based template rendering applications. The features aren't there yet. Maybe there will be. Maybe, I don't know what the demand is, right? I think like most people who are using the functional style, I really like it, right? I mean, I like expressing my intent that way. It sort of reminds me of other programming languages, right? I mean, if you've ever used Ruby, Python, Node, all of those have similar micro web frameworks. So it's kind of it's getting into that space, isn't it? So it's a different experience, is what I'm saying. You probably don't want to implement every single application, especially the big multifaceted monolithic template rendering pet clinics. They probably don't fit very well in the functional world. I did actually create a functional pet clinic recently, so I know what I'm talking about. It probably
Felt the
wouldn't have been
pain.
written that way. Yes,
You're
See the
exactly.
speaking
pain
from
in his eyes,
first.
yeah.
I was also considering migrating it to Mustache because that's my favorite templating language, and maybe not. Maybe I won't do that. That just would make it even more painful. There's a reasonably good Mustache version of Pet Clinic with MVC with annotations, not with the functional. But it's just easier. There are more things to play with, features like controller advice, for instance, and binding and model attribute annotations, those kinds of things that just don't show up in the reactive world in the functional style. They could probably, there probably could be APIs that would generate the same features, but nobody's asked for it yet, so they haven't been provided.
The irony is I have yet found time to dip my toes into the functional version of Spring Web stuff. And so it's like, I want to do that, but I keep having too many other things. So, but
you should try
still
it.
quite interesting.
Next time you want a puzzle, give it a try. It's fun, actually. I do like it.
As
You
much
have to be more descriptive than with annotations, but otherwise.
Yeah, and sometimes you can make bad choices as well, right? You can, you can have the anti-pattern is to have 1,000 lines of a lambda, 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 lambda. And you never extract anything into method references and never make it look nice. I've seen quite a few of those demos. But
Java 8 all the way.
Yeah, we love it.
I do have a metric here. I guess it popped up that apparently, according to the State of Spring survey report, whatever that was done a month or two ago, that says 33% of Spring users are using reactive programming. So there's a metric for you, Dave.
I saw that. I'm skeptical. The audience for that survey was experts, so they went out and tried to find people who were hardcore Spring users. It wasn't like the whole universe. So there might be a little bit of selection bias there, but yeah, that's an interesting number anyway.
And the definition too is a little. It's the numbers are highly dependent on the defension. Did you include the web reactive dependency so you can use web client? Is that
maybe
reactive programming, or is
of
it?
people are using web client, and 3% are using web flux? It's hard to tell from that, but it's an interesting data point. I think downloads from Initializer would be an interesting. Start.spring.io would be an interesting place to look as well. We do have those, but I don't have them at my fingertips, so I can't tell you.
Right. Well, Dave, it's interesting that you brought up the functional. Well, actually, Violeta brought up the functional, I guess. But Dave, you jumped right into it. You dove into the breach here. So it's kind of almost a semi sort of natural segue into the whole approach with Graal, with native imaging, with perhaps a change in how we approach things internally and externally. So do you want to maybe?
Yeah, I could do. So yeah, I mean, that sort of has been what I've been working on recently. I mean, I first got interested in functional Spring programming models, like, I don't know, years ago when I was working on Spring Cloud Function, right? So there's obviously a fit there. And we were just trying to find a way to, I don't know, be more explicit about the programming model is one thing, and two is to try and reduce the overhead of the startup cost, because with functions and serverless, everybody cares about time to first request basically being a key metric. So everything we were doing then just on the regular JVM was sort of aimed towards functional and not using annotations and using as little reflection as possible. And so that has now sort of turned into a bit of an industry because of Graphvm, which you just mentioned. So Graphvm is a big thing, right? It's a big project with lots of different facets, but the one that everybody seems to be focused on or obsessed by is the native images. And so for people who haven't seen that feature, it's a way of compiling a Java program down to a native binary. So it's, in other words, it's not write once, run anywhere. It's write once and compile it to the platform that you're on, and then you have to compile it again if you want to run it on Windows, and that kind of picture. So people do this right with other languages all the time, with Golang, and for being the obvious candidate. So if you wanted to write a little command line interface in Java and distribute it to people to run it on their command line, then making them install a JVM hasn't always been all that easy. So that's an interesting application.
I'm kind of fascinated at the interest in it that's popped up. It seems almost overnight.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah, everybody wants to do it. And I think the main reason is, again, resource usage. So we talked about that in relation to reactive programming generally, and non-blocking actually is probably the link to that. But if you can run, I think it only applies to small applications, right? If you're running an application on a JVM and you've got a 16 gigabyte heap, I don't think native images are going to save you anything. But if you're running a small little microservice that's, pushing up to a gigabyte of physical memory, and it's probably only got about, less than 100 megabytes of heap, you can probably reduce the amount of memory you use for that application by a factor of 4 or 5 by compiling it to a native binary and running it that way. So that makes it, those are numbers that you need to take notice of, right? If you're running that kind of application, then you could spend 80% less on running it. And then there's also the startup time thing, right? So the JVM, they can improve this, I'm sure, but the JVM has never been optimized for startup time. So it's a very I don't know. It's not a very friendly platform for running apps in the cloud at all, because in the cloud, right, you're running in a container, you're running in a constrained environment. They want to give you like a tenth of a CPU, never mind even a whole CPU, never mind 4 CPUs, which is what you're used to in a on your desktop or in a virtual machine. So that's probably fine for the steady state once you get running, right? And your requests are coming in and out, and you can run with your 40-50 megabyte heap, and you can just be in steady state. But the problem is at the beginning, when the app starts, you get a big spike of resource usage, and the JVM just has to load a lot of classes, a lot of binary data has to be pulled in, loaded into memory, parsed, analyzed, optimized. There's all sorts of stuff going on at the beginning when a JVM starts, and there's very little options for getting away from it. It basically always happens. So that's why Java applications take a little bit longer to start up than the binary ones, the ones that you write in Go and compile down to binaries. So there's 2 things that people are excited about, I think, in Graphvm native images. One is fast startup, so like microsecond startup. It's not microsecond, but that's an exaggeration. But practically, for all intents and purposes, instant startup, milliseconds. Maybe 100 milliseconds would be unusual, and memory usage. And so, like I said, it probably doesn't apply to huge monolithic hunking large heap applications, but it probably does apply to smaller, just a few endpoints and an HTTP server, those kinds of applications, ones which don't have much state in memory, ones which don't do a lot of object creation, garbage collection, churn, those kinds of things. So that's the sweet spot for native images.
And I guess when I first heard about it, I felt a little apprehensive about Graal, thinking, are we fixing a 15-year-old complaint about Java that people back in the day complained about? I was like, what's the point? But then I started seeing things like if you're like one of the Netflixes of the world and you're having to run 10,000 instances of a microservice and you're having to pay 4 seconds of startup time every time that turnover happens, then suddenly it turns into money and budgetary costs. And if
Potentially,
you can
yes.
beat that, then that
Potentially.
really is a good solution.
On the downside, I mean, to compile a Java application to a native image, it takes minutes, right? And many gigabytes of RAM. So, you're using all the resources in a different place, basically. So you're hoping that you're going to be able to amortize that cost, right?
Exactly.
So instead of your compilation and you compile your Java classes, you bundle them into a jar file, that might take, I don't know, a minute or something, and it might chew up a few hundred megabytes of RAM. Do it for a native image, and it's going to be orders of magnitude slower and more expensive. So if you only run that service a few times for every time you compile it, then obviously that's a really bad deal.
Right.
So you have to sort of weigh the costs and the benefits up sometimes for these things. But we're kind of committed now to doing this thing, and it has some benefits for regular Spring users as well, because we sort of have to make things a bit leaner and keener to optimize the native images. We sort of need to make the normal Java applications run a bit cleaner and leaner as well. So there have been a lot of changes in Spring and Spring Boot in the last couple of years, and we're continuing to do that. I think the most radical changes will probably come in Spring 6 and Spring Boot 3. So that will probably be, I don't know, in a year or a year and a bit. We're not really sure what the timescale is yet, but yeah, the next generation of Spring and Spring Boot will pay more attention to this kind of thing, I suppose. Or they will run leaner and meaner on a JVM in order to optimize the native image experience, basically. So yeah, some people are busy with that at the minute, and some people are just sort of holding back, waiting to see what the architecture is going to be and what direction they should take.
Well, don't you think, similar to the reactive discussion earlier, that there will be some percentage? Because if you think about, like you mentioned, the long running tasks or the ones that, I mean, if you have a task, an application that runs for hours, let's say, and it has a 2.5 second startup time, and you bring that down to 200 milliseconds, you gain effectively nothing. But
Yeah,
if you
so who
have something
cares at
that,
that level? Yeah, I mean, it depends then on whether it was going to be using less memory,
true,
and then it depends on how much heap you needed, and the heap's probably not going to be much smaller. It's just that all the other memory that the JVM needs is a lot smaller, because it's all optimized into a tiny little ball at build time. So they work out what the JVM can do anything, right? So it has all these dynamic pathways that it can take. The native image can only do this. It can't get out of that ball. So you can optimize down the stuff that can happen in it's a closed world. And that is actually a little bit of a challenge for a lot of Spring applications, because Spring users are used to dynamic behavior, right? You're used to the idea that you can change an environment variable and switch a feature on, right? Well, maybe you can't do that anymore, right? Because you baked into this binary ball the environment as it was at compile time. So you don't get to change environment variables anymore. I mean, you can, and you can react to them, but there are going to be some things that you can't do. And in particular, it's going to be dynamic behavior. So closed world assumptions are going to be the sort of name of the game if you're switching to native images. So that's an interesting, constraint. I don't know if it's a pro or a con. It depends which way you want to look at it.
Now we're trying to make.
Go ahead, Greg. Sorry.
Well, we're trying to make it where if you're going to pick up and use Spring, we want to make it easy for you to either go down the path of native imaging with Graal, or just keep doing what you've always done. And you know, in the past we optimized for bean to bean in the container calls. And so we would by default proxy the configuration classes so that they would do that seamlessly and not make you have to think about that. And so we've, in Spring Framework 5, we decided to adjust, or at least adjust Spring Boot and all of our projects to stop doing the proxying. And I just watched a teammate on Spring Data spend the past 3 months going and refitting each of the Spring Data modules to do that behavior. So you can pick up and
so
run.
That's an example of a very small change that you can make, and we have made in pretty much all of the Spring projects now. So then the latest generation of all Spring projects have this extra argument, this attribute on the configuration classes, is what you're talking about, right? And it was an option that was introduced in Spring 5, not purely for this, but to save a few resources, right? Because if you don't need to create a proxy, then don't, because you know there's a little bit of overhead involved in creating a proxy. But it's very relevant with native images, because you basically can't do cglib. It does allow you to do AOP proxies, but you can't do cglib proxies, and that's what we've always had in our app configuration programming models, cglib proxies. The last thing I was looking at actually was kind of, and I'm sure this is going to develop into something else, but we were looking at, you know, build time compilation of the equivalent of the proxy, so that it's not just for at configuration. It would, you know, it would work for at transactional and, you know, all of the proxy-based annotation programming models. If you could, in principle, there's no reason why you can't compile that behavior in at build time, right? Because that probably isn't very dynamic. It's, if you know the thing is there, then you can build the proxy, build the bytecode, save it somewhere, and then suck it back in at runtime. So that, there are definitely things we can do there, which don't involve setting that flag that you mentioned. But that flag is a good idea anyway, because if you know that you don't need a proxy, then you might as well just say so, and that's all it does. It's just a flag on the class level that tells Spring not to bother creating a proxy, because I know that I don't need it. I mean, it's sort of interesting that you have to do that, but you do. There isn't a way to tell whether you need a proxy just by looking at the bytecode. I mean, you kind of need to you need to compile and get an abstract syntax tree. It would be quite expensive to compute that at runtime. So we give you the opportunity to hint. There's going to be a few, you know, small changes like that, and then probably some more radical ones. The more radical ones will be more along the lines of strategies that you can plug in to replace some feature that Spring has used. So I don't know, Spring factories, for instance. So, you know, Spring Boot loads all of its features from spring.factories properties files on the class path. And it's useful to be able to do that, but it involves reading a properties file, extracting class names, and then instantiating each class reflectively. And there's no, I mean, that all of that information is known at build time. There's no, in principle, reason why you can't, you know, build something that has the same features that doesn't involve reflection at all. So there are some. But then again, why would you care? you only care if you care about whether you're using reflection or not. And so, you know, I think any changes that are made in this kind of area will be strategies that you can swap in and out. So there's a Spring Factories loader, which is the only way to do that right now. But I expect, you know, maybe there'll be another option to load statically load strategies like Spring Factories. I don't know what that's going to look like yet, but I expect that it's going to be something like that.
Well, something I've always enjoyed about Spring is that you can do what you want to. It's always, you can go plug in or pick the way you want to build your app, but the team has put a lot of thought and consideration into what's sort of a best default way to approach things. it was a long time before I realized like Reactor by default knows it will look how many cores you have on your machine to pick a proper sized thread pool. And so you can go in there and change the threading strategy if you want to, but by default, it's trying to kind of pick what the best guess is for how to go write a reactive app to avoid like the context switching overhead and things like that.
It's opinionated. I suppose that's kind of one of the principles that we embody in our framework code, right? Especially Spring Boot. There are opinions expressed and you can override them, but you're probably better off just taking the defaults and for a lot of things. I know you say that in your book.
Okay,
what else? Did we cover everything?
Well, we've had not quite, not really, but we've got a question that just dropped into Q&A a couple minutes ago that Ivan is going to mention, or maybe he was just calling attention to it for us. But it says, I've been in a project using event sourcing and DDD. After 3 years of experience in this project, I constantly feel event sourcing is just a gimmick. And besides accountability or auditability, besides auditability does not add much and wastes many resources. Okay, this is not a strong opinion at all. And I say that without picking on Masood who threw this out there. It's really well stated. And so
it's disappeared. He's withdrawn it.
No, it's over and answered. So I think this is a really great starting point. He says, I want to hear what VMware experts' take on this is. Do you guys ever suggest your clients implement event sourcing? So yeah, that's a phenomenal conversation starter, to be honest with you. And that's probably something that we could do entire day-long talks on. But for just a few minutes, anyone want to take a shot at that?
I'm going to go call Ollie. He would love to chat about this.
Yeah. We have some other experts who would be more than happy. Or Jakub should be here.
Oh, yeah. Jakub would be.
I'll just throw out.
So, yeah, I mean, there are people on our team who have some very relevant experience. And I think they will tell you it's not a silver bullet. It's that old phrase again.
Right.
So don't just try and use it for everything. And probably you'll have a happier life. That would be my impression. It's interesting that we've never actually fully committed to event sourcing there, right? We don't actually have a Spring event source project. I think there's a reason for that. I think there's enough kind of hesitancy about it. A lot of people don't want to fight that battle. But there's some really interesting people doing it with Spring, right? I mean, there are ways to do it. Dave Turansky's done a lot of client projects, and he's written blogs about it. So there's another one.
Like I've seen a lot of technologies come through the halls that people have bet entire companies off of, which I'm always befuddled at that. Like,
yeah,
there's a life cycle to everything, and I've seen whole companies built out of was it Apache Horton or whatever, and pick a message queue. There's several message brokers, and it's always like everything's a tool that you can leverage, but sometimes if you overdo it or overuse it, it may not be everything that you need. You need to. That's part of what experience is putting stuff together and in the right way, or what solves your problem.
Well, I think we all have a tendency in this field and probably many other fields that to adopt that if a little is good, a lot must be better. And I think that I mean, Masood mentions waste many resources. Let's skip the waste part of that and talk about the many resources, because event sourcing and this is something that is a very complex solution to a very complex problem. And I think in many cases, technologists, and I'll just use that more general term, whether it's, the architects or the folks, implementing, but I think many times we tend to over-engineer solutions and apply them more broadly than perhaps they would warrant. So I think there are probably a defined set of use cases. Let's say maybe it's 1% or maybe it's 10% or whatever, of cases that event sourcing really solves a need extremely well. But if you look at probably the number of instances of its application to solve problems, it's probably a much greater number. So just my thoughts.
I know it's difficult,
No.
isn't it? I must say I'm quite interested in when it's appropriate. I haven't really seen a very good explanation of that from anybody, but like, I can remember, for instance, back in the old days when we were designing Spring Batch, we so we had to make a choice about how and where to store data about the batch process, right? So we have this job repository abstraction, and we designed it kind of, I mean, you'd think it's just an interface, you can implement it any way you want, but actually we painted ourselves into a corner a bit, because we basically designed it to interact with a relational database. And if you don't do it in a blocking, query based implementation, then you're kind of stuck. And I sometimes wish that we'd been a bit more open at that point, and we had allowed it to be a logging approach, right, where you just accumulate changes. And that's really the difference, right? If you have a use case where you really care about the changes and you sometimes need to see the aggregate, but that isn't the most important feature, I think that's where you should choose to use these kinds of techniques, event sourcing. DDD, I think, is a completely separate discussion, and that's where Ollie would come in and shine.
Yeah.
Because that's really just about, being sensible about designing software and encapsulation and lots of good engineering practice. I see that as a much less controversial discussion, right? I mean, it's also prone to be kind of followed religiously by people who don't necessarily know what they're doing, but I think we should be careful here to distinguish between event sourcing and DDD, because they're not the same.
Agreed. Yeah, I know DDD can be pretty dogmatic depending on who's pounding on the podium, but yeah, certainly much less controversial in the idea anyway, versus event sourcing, which is much more niche, shall we say? So
DDD for me is just an encapsulation of good engineering practice, right? Just keeping things separate so that you can work on, independent things independently, which is always a good thing. Whereas event sourcing is what we were talking about before, is it's not always a silver bullet.
all right, so let's go back to another question here, actually, since we've kind of, I think, covered that pretty well. Yeah, pick on Greg a little bit, because I have a question out here. Yeah, Greg's looking around. It's like, can I disappear into the fireplace? But this actually came up earlier on R2DBC, and I think you even brought it up. So it's all your fault, Greg. But the R2DBC, the impact it has had on reactive programming. You mentioned that regardless of how many different options there are for databases with reactive drivers and supporting reactive interactions with those databases, people still come and knock on the door and say, but what about my fill in the blank relational database? So how has RTDBC shifted the conversation or expanded it?
Well, I think it's opened the door. I think there's, I've seen people posting stuff like, I've got my R2DBC application in production, which I'm kind of like, okay, that's
good on you.
No promises. But so, R2DBC, just for the record, is at a 0.8 release, and we're doing service releases on it. We had put out a 1.0 artifact initially. So if you go look out, you're going to find it, but that is actually not the latest. So we kind of pulled it back as much as we could to put it at 0.8. But, there's a lot of activity. There's kind of two pieces to that. There's I want to go build my app. I would like to use Webflux and Reactive, but I need a relational database. So there's that side of it. And then there's we need the database driver community, like the MySQLs, the PostgreSQLs, MariaDB, or all these variations. And so there's a community there of driver developers, and it's kind of like we don't have the resources to go develop it for all the drivers for all the data stores. So we're trying to engage the community on that. And, we have somebody out there that's actually, it's a community module, the R2DBC MySQL module. That's a community project. There's also, I'm trying to think, I'm trying to remember if we've gotten somebody to do the, to work on the Postgres side of things, or we're talking to somebody about that. And something people aren't aware of is that JDBC was a spec that defined both one interface or one spec for both drivers and for users. And so there's kind of trade-offs in that. So we actually decoupled that. So there's a driver SPI, and then there's a what clients do. And so there's like a JDO version of an R2DBC client out there that's developed by that community. We have Spring Data R2DBC as a module, but we're interacting with other people like the guy at Juke, Lucas. I can't remember his name.
Ada.
Lucas Ada.
Ada.
Yeah.
So we're trying to interact, and we're building a community in that, and that's what's fascinating to me is that R2DBC is Spring free. There is no Spring in R2DBC because it's below all that. And sometimes people are apprehensive to come up and say, I don't know if I want to touch that. I don't know if I want to get into the Spring stuff. We're like, there is no Spring. We've recently decoupled it from our build infrastructure, so it just runs on GitHub Actions. And
if I can interject something here, I know this is a little bit of off on a tangent, but I think it's important. I'm a history nut, so I always kind of look at the history of things, but I think it's important to remember that, ADBC, wasn't it? Am I getting the acronym right?
Yeah.
ADBA, that's it. Yeah, I knew something wasn't quite right, but it wasn't ringing true. But I think everybody has recognized at some point that we needed to have some kind of a reactive spec, if you will, for interacting with relational databases. And regardless of how something starts, how an initiative starts, there usually is one or a small number of initiators or people and organizations who kind of drive things forward. But it certainly doesn't mean there's ownership there. And in most cases, it just means that somebody takes point. So I think even though that we had a lot of involvement from Pivotal and the Spring team, I mean, there has always been, correct me if I'm wrong, but there has always been a large community demand and contributions in many ways to making this happen, right?
Absolutely. It's been a totally open developed project compared to the Java specs from 15 years ago that, that was a whole different era back then. So we developed this sort of SPI through GitHub issues, essentially, and I think a Google group. But part of it was we launched that effort. We had Pivotal at the time had opinions on what we wanted to, so whether or not that's R2DBC was going to make it, or if that was going to influence the ADBA efforts, we're open to whatever the outcome. What's the best thing that's going to serve the community on that front? And I think after a couple of years, I think the ADBA project essentially folded, and those people have decided to work on R2DBC, and we're trying to make it like, let's make this a very community oriented thing, and let's not be stingy. Let's do that.
So with R2DBC out there, and this was one of the other questions that we got, but with R2DBC out there, then to say it's a level playing field is a vast overstatement. But how does it compare in terms of, let's say I'm starting an application and I have access, my corporation is heavily invested in XYZ relational database from, ABC vendor. And yet I have options, perhaps my organization or my group, my team is open enough to say, well, if a different database fits the need better, by all means choose that. So if I have Mongo or Cassandra or what have you. So how do you make that decision? How does it compare? How do they compare in terms of implementation, as well as perhaps maybe performance, throughput, and ease of implementation and things like that? I know it's such a tiny question, but
Well, I've typically told people, if people ask me about, things like Spring Data query derivation, I think that's one of the coolest things I've ever spotted in tech. And it's not it's not built so much as to make it easier for you to go under the hood and flip a Redis database to a MySQL database. That's crazy. At some point, you need to go and analyze the data store and say, what data am I storing? You need to do that analysis to pick out the right data store to put under you, because it's not that easy to just pick up and move just because you're using a repository based abstraction.
Okay, I still think we have our quote for the day, which is, "That's just crazy." Greg Turnquist.
I think I've heard people like try to put that, it's, you can, if you're not, query derivation lets you write, essentially write select statements or write finders, and Spring Data will parse the method and write it for you, essentially. And that's more so you don't need to write the 80% of the queries that are boilerplate. It gets you away from that, so you can then go write that query that generates the monthly data report that you have to do to honor your contract or something like that. So you still need to be able to write.
So what I love about it is, talking about history, Mark, what I love about it is that it's still SQL right under the covers. So you still have to write SQL even if Spring generates it for you. And that, that's been there since like what, the 60s?
Yeah, and mentioning
Older than
Lucas
me.
Eder, he has very strong opinions about that, by the way. So what is it? SQL and cockroaches will outsurvive us all, or something like that. I don't know.
And if you get Cockroach DB, I don't know. You get them both. I don't know.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. Do they use SQL? I mean, I
don't remember what that one is, but
if not, they're missing a perfect opportunity.
Store.
Yeah. Talk about convergence. Oh my gosh. Well, we're getting
is everybody warm here by the fire?
Yes. Oh yes, it's toasty. We're getting the kind of the 4 minutes remaining mark. So I guess let's see. One question that I want to throw out there, because I think we've covered at least somewhat some of the other ones, but this was something that that Dave didn't allude to, but certainly when he said something, it triggered in the back of my mind that this question needs asked, because somebody posited not that long ago in a very widely distributed article that serverless had hit the shoals. So what happened to serverless, or is it still relevant? Will it be more relevant? I mean, what are thoughts on that? Dave's
That's
laughing.
going to take more than 4 minutes.
Yes. Sum up to.
I think the individual responsible for that comment was possibly being facetious. Shall we just leave it at that?
It's interesting though, and I do think the question is somewhat valid, because it was, again, our field guilty, the shiny object syndrome, because when serverless first started being talked up, maybe first started is a bit of an overstatement, but at some point it caught fire, right? It was everything. And maybe it's just a factor of 2020. There have been a lot of other everythings that have been brought to the forefront of discussion, and you don't hear that.
It's one of those trends things, isn't it? Yeah, like you say, it's hot one minute and not hot the next, but it's still valid, right? There are valid concerns that you can hang that serverless label on. I mean, that's the problem. It's just a label that people have put on so many things just to make them sound hotter. But there are definitely many aspects of today's technology that are extremely relevant to the serverless, whatever it is, programming model, operations environment, and operations paradigm. I don't know, yeah. I mean, there are just so many different ways of interpreting the word serverless. It's hard to know where to start when you've only got a minute. But no, I don't think it's going away.
Violeta, you have anything to toss in on this one?
We have a new product as well, don't we? Tanzu Serverless. I think they just announced it, or maybe they just did that internally. But it's on the launch pad.
Ah. Well, if that wasn't supposed to be released, Yvonne, if you would just kind of like edit this part out.
Yes, I just announced it.
Oops, who said that?
I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, and I'm not giving any details away, am I? Because serverless means everything.
What were you about to say, Violeta? What were you about to say?
Sorry,
Violeta?
yeah. I didn't get you.
Oh, I just said, what were you about to say? I think you're starting to say something.
No. Go ahead.
We thought we were being rude. I'm sorry.
Now Violeta's worried because she's waiting to see if the folks come in with and throw the black bag over Dave's head and take him away. It's like, I'm not saying anything. I wasn't gonna. Nope.
I don't have the numbers, so I don't know how many. I've seen some articles about that serverless looked really neat, like the idea of lots of little serverless apps chained together through some kind of messaging or event sourcing or whatever. That looked cool. So for the people using it, that may be solving their problem today. And I've discovered, talking to my brother-in-law, who's a professional software developer in a totally different universe, that the world of the universe of software development is gigantic, because he didn't know anything I was talking about, and I didn't know anything he was talking about. So
yeah, it's like everything in this world, right? There are it's not a silver bullet. There are going to be problems that you can solve.
That's your takeaway for today's talk.
Yeah, I think it probably
and I have to
is,
say,
that's
Greg,
our badge.
That's good, because you've got a large enough ecosystem that that now you have something to talk about over holidays without diving into other topics. So. All right. Well, as much as I would love to continue this, we probably should wrap it up for the day. And thanks for all who participated, attendees and panelists and everybody behind the scenes who made this happen. And
Bob
we'll
wants to come back. Bob
Yeah.
deserves to come back.
Yeah, Bob, where's
He's gonna
Bob?
kick us
Where's
off.
Bob? Yeah.
I'm here.
Bob's gonna kick us off. Ooh.
That's right.
Bob, I'm slightly worried about your head. It looks like it's sort of hourglass shaped.
Mine? Well, yeah,
Is it
it
something
is,
to do
first
with
of
the
all.
Zoom?
But yes, also has everything to do with probably my background. I'm flirting with new backdrops because, as I said, I couldn't get the one to work. So anyway, c'est la vie. Yes, thank you all so much. This was incredible. The last 2 days have been a lot of fun, and obviously being able to add, sorry, one of my dogs is trying to get in the room, to add the new voices today made it that much more just wonderful. Papa's outside. I'm finishing up real quick. Yeah, he's in the front yard, but don't go outside, okay? Thanks. This is the work life. Got my coworkers asking where the big manager is. Anyway,
I
so
love it.
check out yesterday's talk. We'll be posting that. If you weren't able to see that, clearly this will also be posted later, so that way you can all return to it and check out any stuff that you might have missed or revisit some stuff, as well as our previous Spring One Tour episodes that we've had. Go to tanzu.tv. We have lots of great content on there. And then also a reminder, next month, November 18th and 19th, we're going to be win a spring testing trophy. So all about talking about spring testing. And that's going to have Bella Bai and Alexei Nestorov. So that'll be great. Go to springonetour.io to register. And let me see, I'm getting pinged here. Let me make sure I'm adding everything that I need to. Looks like we are, ready to close it out. So Mark, David, Violeta, Greg, so wonderful. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming and making this happen.
Yeah.